Kia ora and welcome. In this video on writing strategies for research students, we're going to be looking at understanding the argument of a research proposal. Research proposals are really common forms of academic writing. You may run into them for the first time if you are applying for a research degree. You may be asked to write a little brief proposal of what your project is about, or if you're enrolled in a research degree, your first major milestone may involve presenting a research proposal for evaluation by a panel. But if you continue to do research professionally, you'll actually probably write research proposals all the time. You write something like a proposal for ethics committees or for grant applications, and they're also something that you may write or at least sketch out just to orient yourself when you start a new project. It's a good idea to master proposals as a genre of writing, because if you stay in a research field, this kind of writing won't go away. You'll continue to use these skills, so it's worth learning how to do them correctly. So the first thing that's important to understand about a research proposal is that a proposal is about a distinctive quality of scholarly research, which is that scholarly research is risky. Now, to understand what that means, you have to realize that there are two different ways that the word research is used. One is a kind of an everyday colloquial sense of the word, where someone might say that they're going to research what toaster to buy, or they're going to research where to go on vacation. And what they mean by that is that they're going to go somewhere, online and look something up, or they're going to go to the library and get a book and read about something, and that's their research. But that kind of research is sort of reading what other people already know and then making a judgment based on that existing knowledge. Scholarly research is something different. You will do a lot of reading. You certainly will be expected to know what we already know, but the distinctive character of a research degree is that you're meant to develop new knowledge. So the scholarly meaning of research is to carry out a systematic investigation to discover or create something that is currently unknown. If it were just a matter of looking it up in a library, maybe you wouldn't need to write a proposal. But the problem with doing something that's going to take us into a new space, that's going to create something new or develop new knowledge, is that it's an intrinsically risky process. One of the things that might happen is you might put people at risk, maybe just yourself, or maybe yourself and the people who are participating in your research process in some way. Maybe the risk isn't so dramatic. Maybe you wouldn't harm anybody, but you just might not finish. Maybe the project was never something that anyone could do, or something that you specifically can't do. So you might start it and then it might not go anywhere. Maybe it would eventually go somewhere, but you'd waste a lot of time or money or resources that might be better invested in somebody else's project. Maybe you might be wrong. Now, being wrong is not the worst thing for a scholar. Sometimes people are wrong in really interesting ways that stimulate new research and eventually teach us stuff that's more correct. But there are ways to be wrong that are just due to sloppiness or carelessness. There are ways to be wrong that are not useful for moving things forward, and we don't want, ideally, that kind of research to be going on. So the idea is, how does someone know at the beginning of a research project, when we don't have an output yet, whether the project is too risky to go forward, or whether it's likely that the benefits of the project will outweigh those risks? So a research proposal is designed to help other people make this assessment of the project that you're proposing. It's designed to make it easy for other people to evaluate the risks posed by your research before you're so far along in the process that it's just kind of a disaster and a mess and very, very difficult to pick up from there. So you write proposals early. They are intended, among other things, to help fix obvious problems before things get too far along. And if research is deeply risky, they may be intended to stop the research from taking place. So proposals, as I said at the beginning, are an extremely common form of research writing. You'll write proposals during your research degree, possibly only one for your confirmation of candidature, possibly a couple for an ethics committee or a confirmation, or perhaps you might apply for a grant or something like that. But these kinds of requirements to write for ethics committees, to write for grant-giving bodies, to write for a fellowship, even dimensions of job applications involve proposal-like elements. So it's worth understanding what the expectations are for this kind of writing. So the nice thing is, regardless of your field, all proposals make the same argument, and that argument is, please let me do what I want to do. So you have an idea, you think it is a good idea, and you're trying to persuade other people that it is a good enough idea that they'll let you go forward. Now, research proposals have a very specific audience. They're addressed to gatekeepers, to people who have the power to say no. Okay, so to people who can prevent your research from going forward, whether that's because it's a panel of people deciding whether you're allowed to do your research degree, or an ethics committee deciding whether the research can be done ethically, whether it is a funder who's going to say yes or no to your request for funding. They're always addressed to people who have basically the power to say no. And that's important to keep in mind when you're writing. So if you're one of these gatekeepers, what your job is to eliminate unnecessary cost and risk. So research always has some costs, even if it's just the cost to your time as the researcher. There are always some risk, even if the only risk is wasting your time as the researcher. But are they unnecessary? Do you have to undertake those sorts of risks in order to get something interesting out the other side? If there are risks and costs that are necessary, have you done the work required to minimize them? Because you don't want to take any risks because you're sloppy, but a risk that's required in order to get your answer may be justified. So a gatekeeper is going to be weighing the benefits of the research against the risks in order to decide whether the research is allowed to go forward. And that's their job. Okay? And gatekeepers feel bad when they make the wrong call. They feel bad when they say that someone could go ahead and then there's a disaster down the track. They feel responsible for that, so they take this quite seriously. So, if you're going to persuade a gatekeeper to let your research go ahead, you generally need to show three things. You need to show originality, significance, and that you've kept an eye on best practice in whatever your field is. And I'll unpack each of those three. So, originality is really what defines research as scholarly, as opposed to that kind of more informal sense of the word research, where we're just looking up background that's already out there. Scholarly research is original, meaning that it isn't actually possible to answer your question unless we do some new research. Okay, and this is why research involves some level of risk. If we can answer your question just by talking to experts who are around now or looking up the answers somewhere, it's not justifiable to let you go off for whatever length of time with whatever amount of money and do something that repeats existing knowledge. Again, there is a space for what are called replication studies. I'll probably talk about those in other videos. But originality means that there's something that you're contributing that we don't currently know or that does not currently exist. And gatekeepers will be looking for originality because originality can help justify a level of risk. Then there's significance. Now, significance can be a little bit scary. People can worry that it needs to mean things are really, really important. But significance of research just means that your research is likely to change something about how we currently think or we currently act. And that something is important. It doesn't have to be world peace level important, but it is a meaningful change in something that we do or something that we think. And again, this is because some kinds of risk can be offset by potential benefits, and the significance of the research is an indication of what those benefits might be. So if you know the likely impact of your research, that helps your gatekeepers establish whether you're worth betting on, whether it's worth taking the risk. And then there's best practice. Best practice is about showing that you have learned from prior research. So this is sort of doing research in that colloquial sense, reading about what we already know. And that you are unlikely to make foreseeable errors. Okay? Unexpected things crop up in research all the time, and we have to be creative and adaptive and deal with those. But it's not fantastic if a completely predictable, foreseeable problem arises that we would have known about if only we'd done a little bit of advanced reading and prepared for it. So gatekeepers want to be assured that your research isn't likely to be undermined by predictable errors, that you've done your due diligence, that you've gone and looked at how other people have approached this, and that you're going to go about it in a way that's informed by our historical knowledge of similar kinds of research. So, in order to address those three criteria, research proposals tend to have similar components, and mastering the components will help you write persuasive proposals. Now, proposals are often quite structured. You may be given a form. The headings on that form may be different to the vocabulary I have here. You may have more, you may have less. I'm after the structural logic of what you're being asked to do, and then you have to work around the templates in an appropriate way for your discipline and your institution. So in terms of thinking about the components of a research proposal and the criteria of originality and significance, essentially you're addressing originality and significance by trying to persuade your gatekeeper that you have an interesting, significant question. You're trying to excite them about the possibilities of answering your question. So when you show originality, originality is a complex thing. It's not meant to be totally unrelated to anything that other humans have ever done. Okay, so originality is a complex dance where you show that your question relates to existing scholarly debates in specific ways. You situate it in the context of what we currently know. However, it is important to show that your question has not been fully answered. There is more work still to do. There is a space still to be filled in the kind of overall map of what we know. And significance is about saying that that really interesting question that hasn't yet been fully answered, if we answer it, it's going to change something. And it can change something about how we think, or it can change something about what we ought to do, or it can do both, and it depends on the kind of work that you're doing, which of those might be relevant. In general, most PhD level theses will change how we think, and then some of them will also change some dimension of non-scholarly practice, as well as dimensions of scholarly practice. So where do you do this? Now again, proposals are often quite structured. You may be given a form or a template or a pro forma of some sort to follow, but in general, there will be some sort of introductory section. If you're working in an area that's likely to be somewhat unfamiliar to your gatekeepers, you may need to provide some background information for them, and that might go in an introduction or in its own section. And then there'll usually be some kind of brief literature review. Okay, so again, with originality and significance, you look at existing literature to provide a context for what you're talking about, and you identify a space that hasn't yet been fully addressed, and then you talk about the likely impacts of filling in some of that space, and you do that across these sections. In terms of best practice, so you've asked a question, you've convinced hopefully your gatekeepers that it is interesting, that it is original, that it is significant, but it's also important that you know how to answer it. Okay, there are interesting, significant questions that we really don't have the means to answer at this time. Or maybe someone has the means, but not you, in the time frame that you have to do your work. So one of the obligations of a proposal is to make the case that you know a good way to answer that question. And knowing a good way to answer a question has different components. One of the really important ones is ethics. Some kinds of research, it involves any kind of interaction with animals, with humans, there'll often be a formal ethics process where you have to put in a kind of an ethics-related research proposal, and you need to demonstrate that you can answer your question ethically. Even if you are not required to go through a formal ethics process, there are always ethical implications to research. There are often political implications to research. Research is meant to have impact on other people. And anytime there's impact on people, there are ethical questions. So one of the things that your gatekeepers will look at is whether your research can be done in an ethical way. The other thing that they will be looking at in your kind of best practice, in your method section, is that you're actually able to do the research. And this is both a general question, sort of could anyone do this research. But it's also a question about whether you, as the specific researcher or member of a research team, whether you and your colleagues are able to answer the research within the boundaries that currently exist. So if your question could be answered, but only if you happen to get that major influx of money from Elon Musk, maybe that's not going to work for your PhD unless you've got a very clear plan for how that's going to happen. If your question could be answered, but it will take 10 years, and you have to finish your degree within 3, that's also not going to be a goer for a research proposal for sort of PhD level research. Your skills, your resources, sometimes your access to key people who are needed to facilitate the research, all of this kind of practical stuff is part of a proposal. You may have a fantastic, brilliant, really interesting and important question, but if it requires that you get access to a community that's not going to give you access, tough. Okay, that's not going to get through your gatekeepers. So just being able to do it is an important dimension of what you're trying to show in a proposal. And then there's this issue of due diligence that we talked about a bit earlier, showing that you've done enough reading and thinking about your method, the method that you are proposing to use, as well as possible alternative methods to answer your question, and that you can justify the method that you would like to use. There's a complex dance here because often there are multiple possible lines of attack on a particular question. That doesn't mean that you have to use all of them or that you need to apologize for the method that you're using, but you need to be reasonably aware if there are multiple possible ways of getting to your answer and to explain what the strengths and the limitations are of the method that you're proposing. So where do you make this kind of argument about best practice? Generally speaking, it'll be made in some kind of method section of your proposal. Bits of it may be made in the literature review, particularly if one of the ways that your work is original has to do with its method. And it'll be made in your ethics application in a formal sense if your project requires a formal ethics application. Okay, so these are the places you tend to talk about those best practice sort of questions. So the overarching argument of a research proposal is really simple. It's let me do this research. And sometimes I say this kind of thing to undergraduate students who are getting into research for the first time, and they actually write at the bottom of their proposal, let me do this research. Don't write that, okay? It's an implicit argument. The gatekeepers know that you're asking for permission to do the research. So don't write that, but keep it in your head, okay? Every single component of a research proposal, every component, needs to contribute something to an overall persuasive argument that asks gatekeepers to approve the research. Okay, so if you're going off on tangents, if you're including a lot of stuff that, however interesting, does not help you make that case, then those tangents don't belong in the proposal. Make your proposals efficient and targeted and to the point, because they've got a very specific argumentative goal. One of the things that a proposal should not do, however, is answer its own question. And this can be difficult to people, particularly who are just making the transition from undergraduate to postgraduate research, where maybe you're in the habit of kind of writing a full essay, and so the argument of the thing is whatever you're going to conclude. At the point that you're writing a proposal, your research question needs to be open-ended. You do not or should not know how things are going to turn out. Okay? It's not just that it is risky, it's that it ought to be risky. There ought to be some level of uncertainty. And if you write a proposal where in the proposal you say what the research is going to conclude, it can create suspicion. It can create resistance from your gatekeepers. And the reason is, if it's already possible to know how the research is going to turn out, why are we bothering to take any degree of risk? Why are we bothering to let someone spend the time and the risk and the expense and the resources? If we already know this, if we could go look it up somewhere or ask existing experts, then this is not scholarly research and people can go do it in some other context. So part of the fear is if you're already able to answer your question, it's too trivial. The question is not meaty enough to justify the time and the expense of scholarly research. The other concern might be that maybe it's not too trivial. Maybe it's a deeply important, deeply complex question, and maybe you're just biased And no matter what the data shows you, no matter what your research turns up, you're going to guarantee that you get a particular conclusion regardless. And that sets off other alarm bells. That's sort of a dimension of research ethics, is that we be open to where the research leads us. We need to be open to being changed by our research. So you can have a hypothesis. You can have a theory about where you think you're likely to end up. But there has to be some way for the research process to change you, to kick back on that theory. You need to have and demonstrate an open mind. So your question needs to be open-ended for research proposal purposes. You can also have a really good question and it's just not right for the context in which it's being asked, for your skills, for your resources. So whether it's you or whether it's a team of researchers, part of what a proposal needs to demonstrate is that it is doable within the constraints that you're operating under. The other thing, it's often called the so what question, thinking about how to talk about the significance of your research. And this causes some struggles for people in the same way that asking an open-ended question does, which is, how do you know what the significance is if you don't know what you're going to find? But first of all, significance doesn't have to be a huge thing. Okay, you don't have to say that it's going to be world peace, or you're going to completely solve some gigantic problem for humanity. The research needs to change how some group, and it can be a small group of scholars, thinks, or how some group of scholars or other people acts. And that change can come sort of regardless of the outcome of the research. It may be that at the tail end of your research, we now know that the existing scholarship that we've had for a while is more true than we realized. We may now have more evidence in favor of what we already think. It may be that we have a small amount of evidence for some new thing that suggests that we have a new research program and maybe we'll build more and more evidence. Okay? So you do need to be able to define the type of impact that your research is likely to have. But you're not being asked to say, and at the end of this research I will have shown this, and our practice will transform in the following way. So you can talk about significance without predetermining what you're going to find in the research. So again, open-endedness, willingness to be changed by the research process is part of what makes it a specifically scholarly endeavor. The other thing that trips people up sometimes is this issue of gaps, finding a gap in the literature. Now, it's quite common when people are starting out writing proposals for there to be a temptation to over-exaggerate the gap. Okay, so the goal of talking about where your research fits in is not just to show that there's a bit of a question that hasn't been answered, it's also to show that you can connect with existing scholarship. So you want to find a scholarly conversation or argument or set of debates, and you want to connect with those. You're building a bridge between what you want to do and what other people have already done. So you want a gap, but you don't want a chasm. You don't want to be sort of way off floating in space, unable to connect what you do to other people. And there is a tendency when people are new to writing proposals to try to come up with a really big gap. No one has ever written about this thing. And that doesn't go over very well. It creates a suspicion in gatekeepers that you haven't read enough. There's a lot of scholars out there, and scholars have been operating for a really long time. And the likelihood that nobody has written about what you're talking about is really low. So if you're struggling with that, if you're struggling to connect what you're doing with other people, you need to work with supervisors and trusted mentors to find that connection. The other thing that can be a tendency when people aren't experienced with proposals is to think that you create a gap by insulting everybody else who's worked in the field. Oh, these fools, they've totally missed the point. This paints an enormous target on your back. It's not uncommon when people are writing initial proposals, but it's not very self-protective. You don't need to insult anybody. You can add to the discussion, you can even correct or argue against the work of previous scholars while still acknowledging in good faith that they've tried to do something interesting and good in the rest. It may be that you're working in a literature where there's a reason to insult people who've come before. But in general, you want to try to find ways of sort of standing on the shoulders of the prior literature so that you can see further, rather than calling everybody an idiot, which sort of invites your gatekeepers to look on you with particular scrutiny. So you want a gap, but you want a gap that's connected to other people. You want a community of scholars that you're making a contribution to, and you want to be kind of a good individual who's going to continue a discussion with the people who are in your field. Remember that some of those people that you're talking about in your literature review may end up being examiners if you're writing a thesis, and you want to start thinking about that as well. When you're writing about the method of your research project, and this is really at the heart of a lot of what gatekeepers will be looking at for proposals, you may also want to think about two conceptual or logical dimensions of a method section. This doesn't mean that you write about them in two different places, okay? But method sections can be kind of logically divided into what are you going to do, and why is that a good thing to do, given what your question is. So the two dimensions of the method section I tended to divide into a to-do list, okay, the exact steps that your research is going to involve. And you can call that your method, so what you're actually doing. And then your rationale, your reasons why those steps make sense. They correspond to best practice, they're a good idea given what your question is. And sometimes these kinds of rationales or why statements are called methodology. Although you'll find method and methodology used in messy and overlapping ways. So don't worry too much about the terminology, but the gist that you need to talk about what you're going to do and why this is a good thing to do, that's common to all method sections. Now, at some point, when you're finished with your research degree and you're out in the world and you're working in research, you may not need to submit a proposal to an external body, particularly if you don't need grant funding or you don't need ethics. But even if a proposal weren't required, it would be quite useful. So the process of preparing a convincing proposal helps keep you honest. It forces you to attend to certain details about your research. It helps reveal when maybe you've got some sloppiness or you've left some gaps and you don't quite know how to fill them in. Writing a proposal down means that you can circulate it to other people. It is really easy to make a mistake. Even a very experienced researcher can make a mistake. They're just one person. Being able to share a plan around for your research gives you access to more eyes on your proposal, which gives you more insight, which means that you are less likely to do something stupid, and we can all do something stupid. So we rely on each other to improve the quality of what we're planning to do. It is much, much better to catch mistakes on paper before you've started the research process, or at least early in the research process, than midway through your research when you may just have to build a big bonfire and cast a bunch of work on it. So research proposals are important as forms of writing that are addressed to gatekeepers, but they're also a useful form of self-discipline and a practice to get into for your research from now on.